capsules. I grow many. Take 2 capsules each evening. And take 3 capsules each evening. Take 1 to 2 tablets twice daily when needed. Take 2.5 tablets in the evening and sunrise. Take 1 capsule every evening and 1 capsule every day at bedtime. Take 1 capsule twice daily.
Can you feel it in the air? Just lay back and open up your mouths. No, Christ. Humanity ain't rising, and buys us every low. According to anxious sources, we're all depressed, you know. So tonight for the first time, just about 10:30, for the first time in history, it's gonna start raining men. Start raining men. It's raining men. Hallelujah, it's raining men. Fall heads, don't gotta go out, you gotta let yourself get absolutely flat in bed. It's raining men. Hallelujah, it's raining men. Every specimen, pills of cats, dolls and beans, the white and blue.
I did a show in Toronto that was called Fruit Cocktail, and it was the last fruit cocktail that ever was, and it was my really big sort of debut into the gay life in Toronto of a sort. It was a huge cast. I had a featured role as part of the chorus because I didn't have the look. I found out later that the director had wanted me for a main role, but I wasn't old enough for the one part, and the other part I wasn't fit enough. So, you know, that's the way it goes. But I met some really good friends that didn't last forever. One did, but he's kind of drifted away. He was a big part of my life and my mom's life for about 10 years. He was like a brother. But when people get partnered and they have their own lives and they have their own issues, that makes people drift. And then death has a way of really putting a real emphasis on some friendships, as in a punctuation mark, like a period. End of paragraph. End of story. Unfortunately. Anyway, so I had this sort of gaggle of friends, and they were gay, and they were, there were 2 lesbians that I just adored. And then I realized that those of us in the gay community, we're all, not to generalize, but I'm going to generalize, we're all pretty fucked up. And I think maybe a little bit more than your average bear. We have kind of unique wounds that I don't think a lot of heterosexual people have. And that stems from family, that stems from other gays. We just tend to hurt each other because we don't know any better or can't help it. And I'll dive into that later at another point. But that's sort of a secondary trajectory in my life. Anyway, it was around 1996, 97 that I started to have really violent attacks of dizziness that would come out of nowhere. Often when I was having a good time, like socializing with my friends or being at a dinner party. And I would have maybe had a glass of wine, max. I wasn't a big drinker. I'm not a big drinker. But I really wasn't a big drinker. I enjoyed, my friend was a sommelier. And she was so amazing and generous and gifted, and she really introduced me to wine and to good shit. So I have always had a champagne taste on a beer budget, but without the budget, and we'd get the champagne anyway. And so she was very good at teaching me how to develop a taste for red wine, good red wine. Doesn't need to be expensive, but it needs to be good. And I thought that maybe I just couldn't drink red wine, and I wasn't getting blottoed or anything like that. But I would be in this wonderful environment with friends, and all of a sudden I would be overcome with just this crushing dizziness that started to escalate into feelings of just abject terror. Just not feeling well, not wanting to move. Truly debilitating. The most debilitating physical experience that I've ever had. And they just kept getting worse. And at first they sent me for tests for my inner ear. They thought that I might have something called Meniere's disease, which was terrifying to have that prospect. But it was quickly ruled out. And then the conversation started to come up around maybe it was some sort of anxiety. And sure, I didn't know. That didn't make sense to me because when I was having these moments, it wasn't in moments of anxiety. I was my most relaxed. I was my most myself. And these things would come out of the blue and clobber me. And after a lot of talking and ruling things out and testing medications, the conclusion was I had panic disorder. And it was bad. And it really upset my Apple Card. For a good long while. So really in naming this episode, the one about falling through the cracks, I've also sort of subtitled it It's Raining Meds, because this was when my journey started with meds. And the first medication that, well, I should say also at this time as well with the panic, what was starting to happen was these deep feelings of being a fraud or pretending to be somebody that I wasn't. I felt completely disconnected from things. And this was the first time that I had also really acknowledged or been told, because you don't know, but that I was also suffering from depression. And it was getting bad. And it was building. So it was sort of this malaise set in, and then it got stronger, and then the panic came in. And then I remember clearly having a couple of really, really rough days where I just couldn't get out of bed. I was so raw, and I couldn't hide it. I couldn't disguise it. I couldn't mask it. I couldn't pretend my way through it, which I think I had learned how to do, this whole fake it till you make it. And I just can't stress enough how fruitless an endeavor that is. How absolutely futile and a waste of time when, if you're feeling that you have to fake it, then you need to get help. Because that's a warning sign that something is not sitting right. And I remember that through my youth and young adulthood, I had always thought about suicide. That came into my head quite a lot. But I think, for me anyway, when I was younger, I knew what it was. I knew what it meant. I knew the implications. But I always thought, I can't do that to Mom. I couldn't do that to her. And I remember this one morning I woke up, and all of a sudden I knew it didn't matter anymore. And that's when I went to my doctor, and I called and I said, I'm in trouble. And she saw me, and that day I started on Paxil. So Paxil was, for me, a big tipping point, that I remember taking that first pill and thinking, oh God, I felt like I was about to start going down my father's road. But it helped. And for somebody who struggled with weight, it was probably not the best choice, but it was one of the only choices back then, of the myriad side effects that one could have. Paxil was relatively well tolerated, but weight gain was a thing, and I gained 40 pounds. And when you're depressed and part of it is body image, then having a pill that packs on 40 wasn't really ideal. And it also made me quite impotent, which again, I was never really a big sexual creature because I didn't feel sexy. I very, very, very rarely feel that. Yeah, very rarely. And certainly never on my own or of my own. I never feel that in my own eyes. Unfortunate, but true. So, sleep had also always been a real issue. When I was a kid, I didn't sleep very well. I was either terrified and couldn't sleep, or my mind was running and I couldn't sleep. And the panic and the depression made that even worse. So my hours became so fucked up. And to combat that, my doctor introduced me to a drug called Starnock, which has got to be one of the best names ever for a drug, especially a sleeping pill. And at the time, it was non-habit forming. Whatever. It seemed to help a little bit, but not a whole bunch. And as I went on, around 2003, well, Paxil lasted for, I think, maybe a year, and then the weight gain and the impotence was such a problem that we pulled off Paxil and went on to Celexa, which was a relatively new drug at the time. And that one I seemed to react well to. From the time I started Paxil, and certainly by the time I had Celexa on board, my panic attacks were pretty much done. I have had very few in the intervening time, never to the extent. I had two that were as bad, and they were both brought on by pot. So I wasn't, again, I didn't drink, I didn't really do drugs but I didn't really do drugs as a kid. So, hi, hello, hi, do you want to come up and be held? So I was not a big drug kid. So, but pot, THC, as I found out, was the fastest way to a panic attack. So, ixnay. Now I get slightly anxious when I even smell it, because it brings back memories of panic attacks. So I don't like the smell. But it bums me out because it would probably be a very worthwhile therapeutic agent for me, the one with the racing thoughts. But I never really went down the cannabis route. And again, just because I'm completely unnerved by my reaction to THC in any quantity. I know nothing more than it was my quickest trigger, and would happen with meds or not. If I had like a toke on a joint, I was down for the count. I had 15 minutes of giggles and then the panic attack would hit me. So all work and no play makes Robbie a dull boy. Anyway, so by 2003, I was on Celexa. I had moved onto clonazepam as my sleeping aid, and Ativan only in emergency situations, which were few and far between, mostly only when I flew. Which, not that I was, a flying marvel, but, my friends were scattered. So my friends that were here in Toronto all ended up moving to either Vancouver, Los Angeles, and so if I wanted to see them, I had to travel. And then there were weddings, and so mother's little helpers were always on hand. And to this day, I still have Ativan, but I don't take it. But it makes me feel comforted knowing that I have some just in case I need it. I needed it last year. But anyway. So then in 2004, I believe, I was working at Mac, and I loved that job. I wanted that job so badly, and when I finally got it, I was on top of the world. That was just about the coolest thing I could have ever wanted. And while I'd had my grown-up day jobs and I had met a fantastic guy. We were together for 5 years. We bought a house. We had everything. And then we broke up and we sold the house, and I fractured. I really fractured. That whole time, I am still hazy on. Sort of from 2004 till 2008, I'm really fuzzy on memory. I can't believe that's going to upset me even now. That was a long time ago. And he and I are still friends. That took a long time. And we've kind of worked at it, but I think we both realized that we probably shouldn't have ever have been partners, but we were really good friends. And he's still here, or he's still around, and he's helping me in really big ways, still. Which is upsetting on some level, because it highlights sort of how little forward movement I've made in the intervening 20 years. But I'm trying. But it's not all my fault. But while I was at Mac on my birthday, and I do believe it was 2004, or maybe it was 2005, or maybe it was 2006, I don't remember. I was introduced to cocaine. Ah, my love. I am clean. I am in recovery. I am a recovering cocaine addict. I have had a very on and off, again, relationship with her. She doesn't even go here. And she was perhaps the single most powerful discovery of my life. And in a roundabout way, I wouldn't be where I am, for good and bad, were it not for cocaine. And she's a mean bitch. She takes no prisoners. She is a succubus. She's a lying truth teller for me. She showed me what I was capable of in the very best way and the very worst way. She brought out the best in me, and she brought out the absolute worst in me. And I lost friends, and I lost jobs, and I lost possessions, and I lost myself. She took everything. And I kicked her to the curb once. I spent 1 month in a rehab, a residential rehab, if you don't mind, that was hell. Oh God, that can be a story time for another day. And at this point, it was deemed that I was somebody that suffered from concurrent disorders. I'm gonna have to edit the shit out of this thing. I ended up at CAMH, which is, for those of you that don't know, the Centers for Addiction and Mental Health here in Canada, but Ontario for sure. I think there are different ones in different provinces, but CAMH is certainly, I would say, probably the most prominent. Don't kill me if I don't know of other prominent Centers for Addiction and Mental Health. But I sort of had my fill with them. But I entered that system in around 2006, I think. In and around there, 2006, 7. Yeah, so I had to go through the intake process there, which was long and tedious, but important. And you sort of start with a counselor, and then that counselor sort of figures out what he thinks you might need. This is how it worked then. I don't think it works the same. I know it doesn't work the same way now. I was told as much. But this whole process then fed you into groups that would then prepare you for rehab. And then you were assigned a psychiatrist that would then deal with your concurrent disorders and try and figure out just what exactly was happening. And I got labeled as, I knew at that point that I was major depressive disorder. That had been diagnosed when I was 18, under 18, I think. So major depressive disorder was my sort of first moniker, with panic disorder. And then when I got to CAMH, of course, they tag on addiction, and then they tagged on bipolar, but sort of bipolar. So not really sure which one it was. I just know that that never really sat right with me, because while I certainly have the depressive features of bipolar, I never have manic on my own or drug induced. I'm not the rip 'em snort 'em kind of, I wouldn't get in that state of mania, productivity. I wish. I don't wish it on anyone. I just mean productivity would be a feat for me. So they changed all of my meds. And so my meds then shifted to, how did I end up there? There was a whole bunch of experimentation that happened initially, and I don't remember what those meds were, but I remember that I did a sort of, 9.0 from the Russian judges into Effexor, Lamictal, Sopaklone, Wellbutrin, and Ativan on the side. But Ativan really didn't play a part in my life at all. Again, she's just there to keep me company. But my main therapies were Effexor, Lamictal, Wellbutrin. And still, the depression stayed. It was bettered, but it still would rear its head. And it would be excessive and intrusive, and triggerable and not triggerable. Like it could be the dumbest things that seemed to trigger it, but not. And I still had Judy at this time, but we were sort of coming to the end of it. She would not see me when I was actively using cocaine. So there was a sort of a great period of where we kind of blew apart, no pun intended. Or maybe pun intended, I don't know. But that was sort of the beginning of the end of our working relationship, of any relationship. As I transferred over to the psychiatrist, that was a bumpy start. I felt like I was wasting his time. I felt like he had better things to do. This was the impression that I got from him. He would doze off in the middle of our session. So these are things that I put out there into the universe. If you are ever seeing a professional who doesn't seem like they're paying attention or isn't present with you in that moment, you need to call them on that right away. That is what must happen as your own advocate. And I did, and he was very apologetic and was sorry that I had gotten that impression from him, that was not at all the case. But he said right off the gates from that, he said, I'm not really big on talk therapy. It's not my specialty, and it's not what I do. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you, but I don't really do talk therapy. So at that point in my life, because I had spent 30 plus years basically in therapy, I thought, I don't have anything else to talk about. I have nothing else to say. And that was an error on my part. But that was also an error on the part of my psychiatrist, who, especially given my history and what I was up against, to me it is ludicrous that you would have a psychiatrist who is prescribing the kind of meds that I was on and just letting you, left me to my own devices. And I wasn't very good on my own. I wasn't very good at figuring out what the hell I was feeling or why, or what other work I had to do that I thought, oh, I've done all the work. And now I just have to kind of figure out my way through this, which seemed to not, it worked and it didn't work, but here is my big thing that I had the epiphany with my last breakdown. Let's call them what they are. My only caution to people when it comes to specifically the SSRIs or the SSNRIs, or because I can only speak to those. I haven't really been on any other types of, I've tried, but they haven't really worked at all. But, and I said this to my current shrink when we went back on, I ended up off Effexor and then through, which none of you are going to want to sit through in this video. But I ended up back on Cymbalta, and I said to him, I'm afraid to start these again because what they do is they make things bearable for the most part. They make things tolerable. They make you, in my experience, apathetic. They make you apathetic, complacent, because they put the fire out, but it's still smoldering, it's still burning under the surface. So if you're not using that dampening to your advantage, then you're not using the meds, I think, the way that they were intended to be used, which is you have all of this emotion that you can't deal with. You physically can't take it on. You need help. You need, it's just like when people say that they don't buy into antidepressants and they won't go on them because they don't believe in them. You really must think of mental illness as a gaping wound, a huge, open, gaping wound on the person who has it. It is unprotected, open to the environment, so easily infected that to not treat that wound is life-threatening, because that person will most assuredly die from the gaping wound that they have. So you go to the hospital and you get knocked out and you get the wound cleaned and sewn up and cared for. And then you are nurtured until you are back to health. It is the same fucking thing with mental illness. Exactly the same thing, except the wound is inside. But it might as well be. You feel that you are open to the world and open to infection. And an antidepressant, or whatever mode of medication is being suggested to you, is in fact the salve and the dressing and the care that wound requires. It can't be any more simply stated. It's vital. But just like a wound, if you fix it, but let's say it's a broken leg, if you don't, once it's healed, if you don't do the therapy, if you don't exercise the muscles, you lose them. You just become weak. And that's kind of what is required of you when you are on an antidepressant. It requires you to do the work, to do the physiotherapy, the psychotherapy, the psychology, the psychiatry. It requires you to work with a professional who is qualified in the area that you are injured. And I thought I was doing that work. But the problem is, as I found out, my psychiatrist at CAMH turned out to be the biggest crack that I'd ever fallen down. The crack of the quack. Now, I'm certain that my good doctor is very intelligent, and I know he teaches. And he's super intellectual, very smart, probably charming, odd, but you know, so am I. But in, I think it was 2016, maybe it was 2015. I just have to check my notes.
It's raining meds, hallelujah, it's raining meds. Fall heads, don't gotta go out, you gotta let yourself get absolutely flat in bed. It's raining meds, hallelujah, it's raining meds. Every specimen, pills, cats, dolls and things, the white and blue and pink and green. You got fuck Mother Nature, she's a shitty parent too. Her love's like a weapon, and she didn't have to do what she did to you. She taught every angel to drop poison from the sky, so that each and every person could find the reasons why. It's raining mad.